Hey Reddit, I'm Ryan, a 22-year-old college student, and I guess you could say my family has been complicated lately. My dad, Tom, got remarried about a year ago to this woman named Linda. She's in her early 30s, blonde, and honestly looks like she stepped out of a movie set. At first I thought, good for Dad. He deserves happiness. But the more time I spent around Linda, the more she started to show this bitch side. Always complaining, always demanding, and, frankly, making it clear that she thought I was just a burden living under the same roof while finishing my degree. Things were okay-ish until about 2 months ago when her behavior took a weird turn. She'd be on her phone a lot, giggling like a teenager, or heading out at odd hours for errands. It was subtle at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Dad, being the workaholic he is, didn't seem to notice. He was busy with his law practice, working late, and trusting Linda to keep the home running smoothly. Spoiler alert, she wasn't. The moment things clicked for me was about 2 weeks ago. I was sitting in the living room, studying, when Linda came in dressed to the nines. Tight dress, heels, full glam makeup, the whole package. I casually asked where she was headed, and she shot back, "Out with the girls." Okay, whatever. But when I looked out the window a few minutes later, I saw her climbing into some guy's BMW parked a block away. That didn't look like a girl's night. I let it go that time, but then I started paying attention. She'd have random spa days, and come home hours later reeking of cologne that definitely wasn't Dad's. One night, I overheard her on the phone whispering, "I can't wait to see you again." She said she was talking to her cousin. Yeah, sure. The straw that broke the camel's back came yesterday. I was grabbing laundry from the dryer and noticed one of Linda's dresses had a stain on it, right around her chest area. I don't need to spell out what kind of stain it was. Grossed out and angry, I threw it back in the basket and decided I needed to dig deeper. So here's where things got awkward. After seeing Linda's stained dress, I decided it was time to confront her. Dad was working late, and I waited until Linda got back from her supposed yoga class. She walked in, casually scrolling through her phone, and I just blurted it out. "Who's the guy in the BMW?" Her head snapped up, and for a second, I thought she was going to deny it. Instead, she just smiled. "Oh, Ryan, you're such a nosy little thing, aren't you?" Her calmness threw me off, but I pressed on. "I saw you get in his car. I know you're cheating on Dad." She laughed, like, full-on laughed. Then, with this smirk, she said, "And what are you going to do about it? Run and tattle to Daddy." That's when things took a turn I wasn't ready for. Linda stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're so cute when you're all worked up. You know, I've noticed the way you look at me." "What the hell are you talking about?" I shot back, but my voice cracked, and she definitely caught it. "I see the way you stare when I wear my bikinis by the pool. You're not as sneaky as you think," she said, her tone dripping with smugness. I froze. This wasn't where I expected the conversation to go. Before I could respond, she added, "Tom's so busy all the time, and honestly, I've been looking at you for a while now. You're young, handsome. Maybe we don't have to make this a big deal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad's wife, my stepmom, was not only cheating on him but now hitting on me. After she said that, I felt like my brain had short-circuited. Anger, disgust, and, God help me, something else I couldn't explain all hit me at once. Linda is undeniably attractive, and yeah, I'd had the occasional fleeting thought about how good she looked. But this was real, and it was beyond messed up. She reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to tell Tom. This can stay between us," she whispered. I stepped back, feeling like I needed to throw up. "Are you insane?" I asked. "Think about it, Ryan," she said, her voice still calm and smooth. "We could have some fun. No one has to know." I turned and left the room without another word. My mind was racing. Do I tell my dad? Do I keep this to myself? Linda's proposition kept replaying in my head, and as much as I hated it, the thought lingered. What if? I hated myself for even considering it for a second. But I also knew this was a bomb that could blow my family apart. I needed to figure out what to do next. I barely slept that night. My mind kept bouncing between rage at Linda, disgust at her audacity, and this gnawing guilt over the flicker of temptation I couldn't shake. I kept asking myself, What's wrong with me? This was my dad's wife. Even entertaining the thought felt like a betrayal. The next morning, I avoided Linda completely. I waited until she left the house, probably to meet BMW guy again, and called my best friend, Kyle. I didn't give him all the details, just that I'd found out Linda was cheating on my dad and that I was torn about whether to tell him. Dude, you have to tell him, Kyle said immediately. Your dad deserves to know. I know, I said, but it's not that simple. Kyle pressed me for more, but I just told him I needed to think things through. What I didn't tell him was that Linda's little proposition was eating me alive. She was undeniably beautiful, and the way she talked to me, it had left a mark. I felt disgusting for even letting it cross my mind. By the end of the day, I decided I couldn't make a move until I had more evidence. If I confronted Dad without proof, Linda would just deny it and turn it all back on me. So, I downloaded a tracking app onto her phone while she was in the shower that evening. I hated doing it, but I needed something concrete. And honestly, part of me wanted to know if she was with BMW guy, or if her attention was now focused on me. The tracking app didn't take long to deliver results. The very next afternoon, Linda's location pinged at a hotel on the other side of town. I drove over, parked across the street, and waited. I felt like a stalker, but I needed to see for myself. About an hour later, Linda walked out of the hotel with BMW guy. He was tall, muscular, and exactly the kind of guy who'd think he was God's gift to women. They kissed in the parking lot before getting into his car. My stomach turned as I watched. But then something happened that I didn't expect. After BMW guy drove off, Linda didn't get into her own car. Instead, she walked back into the hotel. Curious and a little reckless, I decided to follow her. I slipped into the lobby, keeping a safe distance as she got into the elevator. I waited for the next one and guessed her floor. When I got to the hallway, I saw her standing outside a door, knocking. The door opened, and I nearly lost my mind. The guy who let her in wasn't BMW guy. It was my dad's business partner, Mark. I ducked back around the corner before they saw me. My hands were shaking. This wasn't just about some random affair anymore. Linda was cheating on my dad with at least 2 men, one of whom he trusted professionally. I left the hotel and sat in my car for what felt like hours. This wasn't just a betrayal of my dad's marriage. It was a direct attack on his career and life. I had the proof now, but what was I supposed to do with it? I drove home in a daze, replaying the scene over and over. Linda wasn't just cheating. She was running a whole operation behind my dad's back. It wasn't just BMW guy anymore. She was sleeping with his business partner, Mark. How could I even begin to explain this to my dad? When I got home, Linda was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened. She barely looked up when I walked in. "You okay, Ryan? You look tense," she said with a smirk. "I'm fine," I muttered, avoiding her gaze. I went straight to my room and started compiling the evidence. Screenshots of the tracking app, pictures I'd taken of her leaving the hotel with BMW guy, and a quick note about Mark's involvement. I wanted to have everything ready for when I finally broke the news to Dad. But then, Linda knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "What do you want?" I snapped, shoving my laptop closed. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her smirk growing. "You've been awfully quiet lately. Is there something on your mind?" Her tone was mocking, like she knew exactly what I'd been up to. "Don't play games with me, Linda," I said, my voice shaking. "I know what you're doing. With BMW guy. With Mark." Her expression didn't even flinch. Instead, she crossed the room and sat on the edge of my bed. "So what's your plan, Ryan? Tell Tom and blow up his life? Or maybe—" She paused, leaning in closer. "Maybe you'd rather keep this between us." I stood up, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. "You're unbelievable," I spat. "You don't even care, do you? About Dad. About what this will do to him." Linda tilted her head, studying me. "You really don't get it, do you? Tom's too busy to notice. He wouldn't believe you even if you told him. But you—" Her voice softened, and she gave me this look that sent a chill down my spine. "You're young, smart, handsome. We could make this work, Ryan. Her words hung in the air, and for a split second, I froze. She reached out, trailing her fingers down my arm, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. Think about it, she whispered. No one has to know. You've already been keeping my secrets. What's one more? I yanked my arm away and backed up until I hit the wall. Get out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled as if she'd won some kind of game. Suit yourself, she said, standing up. But you'd better think long and hard about what you're going to do next. Because if you make the wrong move, Ryan, it's not just me who gets hurt. Your dad could lose everything. With that, she walked out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I felt like I was being ripped apart from the inside. I hated her for what she was doing to my dad, and for the way she was messing with my head. I hated myself for the tiny part of me that found her offer tempting. I sat there for hours trying to figure out my next step. Should I tell my dad? Should I confront Mark? Or should I just keep quiet and hope it all blew over? The worst part was that Linda was right about one thing. If this went public, my dad's life would be in shambles. His marriage, his business, his reputation. Everything he'd worked so hard to build. I didn't know if I could live with myself if I was the one to destroy it. After a sleepless night, I came up with a plan. It wasn't perfect. Hell, it wasn't even good. But I couldn't just sit back and let Linda ruin my dad's life. I decided to confront Mark first. If he felt even a shred of guilt, maybe I could scare him into ending things with Linda and coming clean to Dad. Mark owned a small law firm downtown, so I showed up unannounced, walking into his office like I belonged there. His assistant barely had time to look up before I was already in his private office, slamming the door shut behind me. "Ryan," Mark said, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I know about you and Linda," I said, my voice low and firm. The color drained from his face. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking a lot less confident. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the crap, Mark," I snapped. "I saw you with her at the hotel. I know you've been sleeping with her behind my dad's back. You think he's going to let this slide when he finds out?" Mark's eyes darted to the door, like he was checking if anyone could hear us. "Ryan, listen," he said, holding up his hands. "It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," I shot back. "You're screwing my dad over, and I'm giving you one chance to fix it. End it with Linda. Tell Dad the truth or I will." He stared at me for a long moment, and then his expression hardened. "You don't understand what you're getting into, kid," he said. "Linda's not some innocent little housewife. She's dangerous. If you cross her, she'll burn your whole family to the ground." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," I said, turning to leave. "You've got until tomorrow." That night, things got worse. Much worse. I was in my room, going over the evidence again, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "We need to talk. Now." My stomach dropped, but I couldn't ignore her. I found her in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine like she didn't have a care in the world. "So, I hear you've been talking to Mark," she said casually, swirling her wine. "How do you—" I started, but she cut me off. "Mark called me, Ryan. Told me everything. I warned you not to get involved." "Warned me?" I said, my anger bubbling over. "You're destroying my dad's life, and I'm the one who needs to stay out of it?" Linda slammed her glass down on the counter, her calm facade cracking. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she hissed. "Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. But you don't know what you're dealing with." "I know enough," I said. "And I'm telling Dad everything." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw real fear in them. "You think he's going to believe you?" "I'll tell him you're lying. That you've been coming on to me." "Who do you think he'll side with, his wife or his screw-up son?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't even thought about how this might look to Dad. She wasn't just playing games. She was gearing up for war. "I'll figure it out," I said, though my voice wavered. "You won't get away with this." Linda stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you try to take me down, I'll make sure you lose everything. Your dad, your future, your dignity. Do you really want to go there, Ryan?" I stood there, frozen, as she walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile. She knew she had the upper hand, and for the first time I wasn't sure if I could stop her. After Linda's threat, I realized I couldn't handle this on my own. She had too much leverage, and my dad was too blind to see through her manipulation. I needed backup, someone who knew how Linda operated but wasn't under her thumb. That's when I thought of Melanie, my dad's secretary. She had been working with him for years, and she wasn't exactly Linda's biggest fan. Linda had once snapped at her during a company party, and I'd overheard Melanie muttering, "Gold-digging bitch," under her breath. The next day, I swung by my dad's office under the guise of dropping off some paperwork. Melanie greeted me with her usual cheerful smile, but her expression shifted when I asked if we could talk in private. "Is everything okay, Ryan?" she asked, closing the door behind us. I hesitated for a moment before spilling everything. Linda's affairs, her threats, even her disgusting proposition. Melanie listened intently, her face growing darker with every word. "I knew she was trouble," Melanie said when I finished. "Your dad deserves so much better. Can you help me?" I asked. "I need proof. Something undeniable that'll make my dad see who she really is." Melanie thought for a moment, then nodded. "I have access to your dad's business records. If Linda's been sneaking around with Mark, there might be something shady in the financials. Let me see what I can find." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Knowing someone else was on my side gave me a sliver of hope. That evening, Melanie called me, her voice urgent. "Ryan, you're not going to believe this. I found something." We met at a coffee shop, where she showed me a series of emails between Linda and Mark. They weren't just having an affair, they were embezzling money from my dad's company. "They've been funneling funds into a fake consulting firm," Melanie explained. "Your dad's business is the front, but the money's going straight to Mark and Linda. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. This wasn't just about my dad's marriage anymore. Linda and Mark were robbing him blind. "We need to tell my dad," I said, my voice shaking. Melanie nodded. "But we have to do it carefully. If Linda finds out we're onto her, she'll do everything she can to cover her tracks." That night, I started drafting an anonymous email to my dad. I included screenshots of the financial records and a brief explanation of what Linda and Mark had been doing. It wasn't the direct confrontation I'd imagined, but it was the safest way to get the truth out without Linda catching on. As I hit send, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The evidence was out there now. All I could do was hope my dad would believe it, and act before it was too late. The next morning, I sat on pins and needles, waiting to see how my dad would respond. I didn't hear anything from him all day, and by evening, I was convinced Linda had intercepted the email. But then, just as I was about to spiral, my dad called me into his study. He looked exhausted, like the weight of the world had dropped on his shoulders overnight. "Ryan," he said, motioning for me to sit. "I got an email this morning, anonymous, about Linda and Mark." My stomach churned. "What did it say?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "It had screenshots of financial records," Dad said, his voice breaking slightly. "It claimed Linda and Mark have been embezzling money from the company." He paused, rubbing his temples. "And that they've been having an affair." I could feel my heart racing, but I kept my face neutral. "Do you believe it?" Dad sighed. "I don't know what to believe, but I've already had our legal team start an investigation. If there's even a shred of truth to this, I'll deal with it." His tone was cold, detached, the way he got when he was in full lawyer mode. But I could see the hurt in his eyes. He didn't want this to be true. "And if it's true?" I asked cautiously. "Then Linda's out," he said firmly. "Out of my life, out of the business, everything." I nodded, trying not to let the relief show on my face. For the first time, it felt like there might actually be a way out of this mess. The investigation didn't stay quiet for long. By the next day, Linda knew something was up. I came home to find her pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Ryan," she snapped when she saw me. "Did you tell Tom?" I played dumb. "Tell him what?" "Don't play games with me," she hissed, her face red with fury. "He's asking questions about the business. About me and Mark. This has your fingerprints all over it. Maybe you should be asking Mark what's going on," I said, My voice calmed despite the chaos inside me. Linda's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "If you think you're going to win this little game, you're wrong. I always come out on top." "Not this time," I shot back. "You've been playing with fire, and it's finally catching up to you." Before she could respond, my dad walked in. The tension in the room was palpable as his eyes darted between us. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Linda immediately switched gears, her face softening as she turned to him. "Tom, honey, Ryan's just upset. He's been accusing me of the most ridiculous things." "Like stealing from the company?" I asked pointedly. Linda's jaw tightened, but she kept her smile plastered on. "Of course not. Tom, you don't believe any of this nonsense, do you?" Dad didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Linda with a calm, calculating expression I hadn't seen before. "I don't know what to believe yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." Linda's smile faltered, and for the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. The next few days were a whirlwind. My dad's legal team worked fast, and the evidence against Linda and Mark piled up. They found paper trails, shady financial transactions, and even email exchanges that made it clear they were embezzling money. The affair was almost a footnote compared to the financial betrayal. I stayed out of the way, watching as Linda's world unraveled. She tried to act like everything was fine, but it was clear she was scrambling to figure out her next move. Then came the final confrontation. My dad called a meeting at the house. Linda was already seated in the living room when I walked in, her usual confidence replaced by barely concealed panic. Mark wasn't there, and I suspected he was smart enough to be hiding out until the dust settled. "Linda," my dad said, his voice steady but cold, "I've reviewed the evidence and there's no denying it. You and Mark have been stealing from me." Linda started to interrupt, but he held up a hand to silence her. "Save it. I've already terminated Mark's partnership and reported this to the authorities. You're next. My lawyer will be serving you with divorce papers, and I suggest you start packing your things." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Tom, wait. This is a mistake. Mark manipulated me. I didn't know what was going on." Couldn't help but scoff. "Give it up, Linda. You're caught." She shot me a venomous glare before turning back to my dad, tears suddenly streaming down her face. "Tom, please. I made a mistake. But I love you. We can fix this." My dad didn't even blink. "You don't love me, Linda. You love money and you love yourself. And now you'll have neither." Linda broke down, sobbing into her hands, but my dad was unmoved. He handed her an envelope. "This contains the terms of our divorce. You'll get what's fair, nothing more. If you fight me, the authorities will get involved, and you'll be facing criminal charges. Think carefully before you try anything." It was brutal, but it needed to be done. Linda moved out within a week, leaving behind nothing but bad memories and a few designer shoes she probably couldn't fit into her car. Mark tried to lay low, but my dad pressed charges against him, and last I heard, he was under investigation for fraud. As for my dad, he was devastated, but he started picking up the pieces. I stayed with him for a while, helping out where I could, and eventually he seemed to find peace in moving forward. And me? I finally felt like I could breathe again. Exposing Linda wasn't easy, but it was worth it to protect my dad. It's crazy how one person can come so close to tearing your life apart. But in the end, I think it made us stronger. Good riddance, Linda. You won't be missed.